Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished professional from Wisconsin, USA, Mr. Derrick Van Mell. Derrick, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Ash. Delighted to be on your show.
Thank you. Derrick is the principal of the Center for Management Terms and Practices. He's an author, and all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of 3 books, including Atoms and Orchestras, The Case for Standards-Based Management. So, Derrick, we're going to talk about the Center for Management Terms and Practices, but a few questions before that for you. Tell me about your own journey and what was the pivotal moment in your 25-year advisory career that sparked the idea for the Center for Management Terms and Practices?
Well, I love talking about myself, Ash, so thank you. But I started my career really as a consultant specializing in large capital projects, facility projects. And then I started to observe whether I was working with a hospital or a manufacturer or a service firm, foreign or domestic, that they struggled making these big decisions because they didn't have a strategic plan. I have a story about a CEO who had a plan. Well, he had a binder that said plan on it, but it didn't have anything in it. And so I started to ask about that. And that's prompted, my first book, which is about buildings and that decision-making process. But then I realized there needed to be a whole new way to do strategic planning. And because people just don't do it, it's less. We did a national study here in the US. It's 9% of businesses have a plan they follow.
Wow.
And so my career then evolved from project planner to strategic planner. And then I observed, so much confusion about really fundamental issues in management. And I was in meeting after meeting, realizing that people might be talking about, any management topic. But one stood out for me, which was working with a manufacturer of trucks. And the subject of market research came up. And I'm trying to facilitate a discussion, understanding with the 10 executives in their boardroom, off the edge of their factory. And I realized no one had the same idea of what market research was. They didn't know, they really didn't, they all felt that they knew, but they didn't have the same understanding. And that opened my eyes to me that there's no standard terminology or taxonomy for management itself. There is in every other field of human knowledge. But so the need to standardize that and the benefit of that, to help, for example, 10 well-paid executives in a large company being able to meet on a management topic and know what the heck everybody else was talking about.
Amazing.
So that was a pivotal moment for me. That was about 2017. And then we formulated what we call the Index for Management Terms and Practices. It's a free resource. We're the standards body. And that evolved, we realized there were needs for some other standards about ethics and competence and so forth. But I'm going to guess we're going to get to those, as we go along.
I'm sure we will. What exactly is standards-based management, and how is it different from traditional management approaches?
Well, it really means it's really quite literal. So to imagine, if you will, and you can see this all online. It's a single screen, but imagine that you have, on your cell phone or your laptop, wherever you want to go, a standard set of definitions, a structure for the discipline of management. What is finance? How does HR break down? What does the COO do? And a standard set of terminology, which also defines what those roles are. The other set of standards that managers, particularly younger managers, are craving is a standard of ethics. How do managers use their power to be helpful, not to be hurtful? And a standard of competence. What does a manager need to know? In fact, raising the fundamental question, what is a manager? Another pivotal moment, if you can mathematically have 2 pivotal moments, was a conversation I had with a woman who has just been hired by a government of a country to set up a leadership development program. And And so I asked her, in all innocence, well, how do you define leadership? What does that mean to you? She said she couldn't. And so that was another, epiphany for me. I realized so much confusion about what is a manager, what is a leader, are they different? And so you train on standards, just like a musician is going to train in musical notation. Now you have a standard language, you can collaborate and you can build from there.
Very well said. And you're so right. If you were to ask 12 CEOs the meaning of leadership, you'll probably get 12 answers.
I have done that, and you're absolutely right.
Absolutely. Your mission emphasizes ethical, caring leadership. Was there a personal experience or mentor who instilled the vision in you?
Absolutely. When I was just out of college, and like all college graduates, I had my head full of ideals and dreams and aspirations. And I went to work for a company that had very poor leadership and management. In fact, it was very painful, stressful. One reason I'm self-employed is I still have some of those scars. And so that was hard to go through for a couple of years. But then one day I was told, you have a new boss, a gentleman named Ron Jarek. I was basically the file clerk, if you will, on a large real estate project in Boston, Massachusetts. And my life changed instantly with Ron, who was the caring, competent, ethical person we all want to have as a boss. And from that first day, my life changed. I felt I was important. He understood what I knew, what I didn't know, what I wanted to learn. He laid out a set of challenges for me. I never thought of him as boss. We were two guys working together, and my career took off. And really more important, I loved coming to work instead of hating coming to work. So that gentleman has been my model for me. And I've learned a great networking tip for your listeners is just ask people, tell me about your favorite boss, and then sit back for about a half an hour as they tell you.
Amazing.
And hear what difference they make in their lives.
Incredible. What a great suggestion. And I'm sure my viewers and listeners can think about this thing. What do you remember about a great boss? And thank you. My next question, Derrick, is how do you define competence and ethics within the framework of standard-based management?
Well, I'll start with ethics. So the discussion of corporate ethics is in a way a different topic. That's how does the organization behave in the world? And I know you've covered a lot of that, Sullivan principles and so forth and so on. But the ethics of manager to employee is based on how they use their power. And from that early experience I was telling about when, I was the file clerk, one day I was in the file room, filing drawings, folding them, sticking them away. The human resource director comes up to me and says, Derrick, here's your new assistant. I had no idea that was going to happen. And years later, I reflected on that. I realized how much power even the file clerk had over the junior file clerk. I could, with one word or a day of neglect, a boss can just make an employee's life miserable, not on purpose,
correct,
just by not using their power correctly. And people are often not told about that, when they take a management position. So the Pledge of Managerial Power, again, these are standards available, on our website, is a one-page document. It's about, do you understand? Are you aware of the power that you have? Have you introspected? Have you thought about how you need to use your power for each employee appropriately? Because people are very different. And are you going to set an intention every day? Am I going to use my authority, to help others? Now, I'm going to leave aside the terrible managers who make it into the news, the really abusive people, and we all have those stories, unfortunately. But people can misuse their power not by hurting people, but by not being decisive, not dealing with an issue on a team, not fighting for resources for their employees and their teams. So people can use their power. One way to misuse your power is not to use it enough. So that's the ethical standard. And then the standard of competence is starts with the idea that a lot of people think about manager as supervisor, right? How I'm going to run my team. They think that that's what management is.
Mm.
And certainly the definition of management that we provide, the standard
Mm.
definition, is a manager is someone who helps people work together.
Mm.
But being a manager means three other things besides supervision. It's about your own personal development. That's time management, decision making, your own goal setting, self care, your own ethics. It's also about uh, business acumen, competence. Do you know enough about the practice of management so you can work cross functionally? And that's what the index I've described earlier lays out, again on a single screen.
Well said,
and then the
well
fourth
said.
aspect is the organizational perspective. How do you relate to organizations outside of your own, vendors, customers, the community? How do you lobby or advocate for your industry or cause? So that's the manager's role, is more complicated than just supervision. Hard enough. And a point I make, and I'm often teased that I take the fun out of it, is that management and leadership is hard to do.
Right.
There's no false promise here.
Correct.
But it is worthwhile. It's enormously worthwhile.
Very well said. Great response. Thank you. Based on all the work that you're doing with so many organizations, what are some common challenges organizations face when implementing standards-based management?
Now, that's a great question. And I've been thinking hard about it and how that's different from country to country as I'm starting to work, globally a little bit more. But one is, it's very simple, is that the confusion about the role of the manager. So I said earlier, a manager is someone who helps people work together, right? And everybody knows, all your listeners knows, that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
A leader is someone who inspires people to take a risk, accept a big challenge. But they're not different people. They're not different people. A manager has to have leadership ability. A leader has to have management ability. And so one of the first barriers is confusion about the role in a very fundamental way. And the standards, of course, help make that clear. So that's one issue. The other is that because there have not been standards for so many years, there are, I think, 877 accredited business schools around the world, but no standard definition of what is a manager. What do they need to know? So what's happened is that people seem to accept that management is, by definition, chaotic. They're often what I call 11:59 managers. It's a minute to midnight. Here's the deadline. Running around. Expression in America we have, with your hair on fire. And that people seem to think that's what management is. It's always chaotic. And the idea that, no, if you bring standards, just like in every other industry or a technical field, once you use standards, the confusion level, the chaos, comes way down. People understand at a fundamental way through experience, standards bring consistency, quality, and the opportunity to collaborate. I like to do home improvements, and I'm sure this is true around the world. I have, of course, these are not metric, but the number of threads on a screw I use to put in a new outlet, that's standardized. And without that, there'd be chaos. And really, the analogy kind of applies to management too.
Fascinating. And how have frontline employees responded when leadership teams have adopted these practices?
Yeah. Well, so far the response has been great. And one of the things I was surprised is that when I said, okay, here's the standard terminology within a structure. The formal word is ontology. And there's a long, boring story about taxonomy, science, and how it's structured. I thought that people would challenge me all the time about this definition. I don't agree with this definition. I don't think that you've organized these in the right way. That's only happened twice in 10 years. I think that people are so grateful to have a common language that they're willing to adopt the standard because of all the benefits it provides them. They have clarity. They not only do they understand what other people are saying and doing, but they also have confidence that people are now understanding what they are saying and doing. Right. And we all want to be heard. But I think more important is the acceptance of the standard of ethics, the pledge of managerial power.
Correct.
The young generation managers are now absolutely prioritizing, ethics, compassion, meaning in their work, and they see what we're offering as a way to get there. Again, not easy, but it is a solid path. So the acceptance has been really pretty good.
Amazing.
It takes time to change habits.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. But tell me, how does this approach support long-term strategic execution and not just a tactical win?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, in a couple different ways. Many of your guests have talked about the expression, culture trumps strategy, right? How well we get along, how well we function as an organization. That is the best way to be successful in the long term, right? People are speaking the same language. They're being held accountable, but to the same standard. There's fairness in how they're reviewed and their performance. So you generate, it allows to build a genuine culture of collaboration by using standards. Again, the analogy to, in music is you give a group of musicians who may speak different languages all over the world, but you give them a common score and they can perform together and collaborate together and innovate together.
So that's a very, very clear response you've given. But my other question is, you mentioned you started to work across different countries. And of course, in the US itself, which is so amazingly diverse culturally, how adaptable is this framework across cultures or industries? And each of these cultures have probably got differing work styles and differing expectations.
Well, that's to me one of the most interesting questions I'm answering or trying to answer, now. So on one hand, the discipline of management is a universal thing.
Correct.
Right. And I could go on about studying the history of business, but just a real brief detour into history, the Venetian Empire, which lasted from the year 700 to 1758 until Napoleon took it away. I mean, it was basically a commercial enterprise. And they did everything that we do today. They had human resources. They had not only insurance markets, they had reinsurance markets and currency exchanges. So they had all the techniques and issues. And an observation that someone made, a woman with a PhD in taxonomy science, how do you organize ideas? When she looked at the index, she said, Derrick, this is not a catalog of human inventions,
right?
Of techniques. This is an observation of fundamental human nature. And that, I had to go lie down on the floor after I heard that. That was so powerful. I realized management, how we work together for advantage, is fundamental to us. So therefore, to answer your question, pardon the long detour, but the answer is that there's something fundamental in all of us, wherever we are, whatever country we're in, we crave working together. So that gives a solid basis. However, there certainly are cultural differences in how people work. And I know you've covered, with lots of different ways, not only because your guests are from different cultures, but also they've talked about this, that certainly how decision-making is done in India, in France, in Japan, in America, Wall Street versus Main Street in America. Yeah, that's very different. So the standards-based management is very flexible, very scalable. However, by emphasizing your use of power and the importance of compassion, I hope that what we're doing is we're actually listening more carefully to the people we work with and recognizing cultural difference. So a specific example is I'm working now with a manufacturer, multinational. They're based here in Wisconsin, but they have several facilities in Europe. And we're doing a training cohort that's mixed, and a great number of Americans and a good number of French. And so how they're talking about leadership, how they're talking about management, decision-making, delegation, those differences are becoming really apparent. And we're doing our best to help people observe that. And I hope respect, and I know that I'm confident with this group, respect those differences and learn from them, right?
I'm sure. Fascinating. Derrick, I have time for two more questions.
Sure.
My next question is about your book, Atoms and Orchestras. What is the metaphor meant to convey about organizations and leadership?
Well, I mentioned musical notation, so that's orchestras.
Yeah.
And musical notation was invented in about the year 1000 by an Italian monk who wanted to literally harmonize sacred music, Western sacred music. And that system that he developed, 1,000 years ago, is still being used. And as I've said before, it allows people to collaborate, innovate, and enjoy being together. But the atoms is about the periodic table of elements. I mean, to me, it's just the most amazing idea that it was in 1869 that a Russian physicist, Mendeleev, had the idea of how to organize all the physical matter of the universe by creating the periodic table. And that basic structure, and we still have that handwritten notes from that afternoon, February, 1869, of atomic weight, atomic number, and so forth. And that still is the structure of the periodic table today. It only has had a little bit of elaboration over the years. But without that, I would say, well, Darwin's idea of evolution was the most profound idea outside of spiritual beliefs that anybody has ever had. Mendeleev's idea was the most valuable, because without the periodic table, we would have none of the modern world, really none of it. But to the point about as an analogy to what I'm trying to do in my own modest way, is it's a common language. The periodic table lets chemists and physicists collaborate, and then of course the engineers who apply those ideas. But without that periodic table, there would be no common language.
Correct.
You're not going to have a physicist in China coming up with their own idea of where helium should go on the periodic table. It's all pretty well established.
Yeah.
It's much richer than that.
Absolutely. Very well said. And my last question for you, what gives you the most hope about the next generation of managers and their willingness to lead with both competence and compassion, of course, with standards-based management?
Well, Ash, thank you. And that's a great way. It's a great way to put a bow around to summarize what I'm trying to do. I have a lot of hope because I mentioned earlier, I think these younger managers are now insisting that the workplace be safe, that they're appreciated, it's ethical, that people are treating each other well, compassionate, and caring. And they also are globalists, all of them. Even if they run a 3-person, software shop in the middle of America, they're a global business.
Yeah.
So to give them a language that they can use to speak across all kinds of borders is huge. And a story I love to tell, very short. There's a co-working space here in Madison, run by this amazing woman who's building a really good community. And she's dedicated the space for women of color who want to start a business. And so she asked me in to talk to four of her co-workers. And so I asked them the question, how is the language of management, how is that a barrier to you as you go to the banker and the accountant and the lawyer? Well, they all started laughing because, of course, how short of getting an MBA, how is an entrepreneur, someone who is not sort of a privileged person, how are they going to reach out to the resources and people that they need? So that when that moment happened, they were laughing at me. But even still, I said, this is why this is so important. So my picture, Ash, is that 2028, you and I are at our first international conference. You can pick the city. And we have 1,000 young managers and leaders around us talking about how to use this, not just to make money in business, but how to reach out across all these important social borders that we can all see, we need a new generation of leaders. So that gives me a lot of motivation and courage and hope for the future.
Wow.
My own small contribution.
What a great response. And on that note, Derrick, I just want to say, this has been such an amazing conversation. I think as human beings, we all love structure. We all love discipline. Yes. We tend to deviate sometimes, but it's very critical in our lives to have standards. And I think you're doing an amazing work bringing those standards into management, bringing those standards across the whole world to organizations, to people, and to leadership. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ash.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.